Parents accused me of trying to steal my sister's husband. Years later, my sister caught her husband cheating and found out he framed me by saving his AP's number using my name. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, still reeling from the events of the past few months. It all started when my life took a drastic turn just one day before my final exams because my parents accused me of something unthinkable and kicked me out of our home. I was part of a very close-knit family, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. My parents were strict but loving in their own way. They had high expectations for us, always pushing me and my sister, Lisa, to be the best we could be. Lisa was the golden child, beautiful, smart, and successful. She had everything going for her, including a wonderful husband, Brad, who seemed like the perfect match. They got married young, and though they initially moved out, they ended up back at our family home when Brad got a job close by. My parents were thrilled. They loved having them around, and in a way, so did I. Despite the constant comparison between us, I looked up to Lisa and was happy to have her close. As for me, I was still in college, and my life was very much dictated by my parents. My school was nearby, and when I suggested moving into a dorm for more independence, they immediately shut it down. Why would you waste money on a dorm when you can stay here? They'd say. It wasn't just about saving money, though, it was about control. They liked knowing where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing at all times. I convinced myself it was because they cared, but deep down, I knew it was suffocating. Our house was always busy. With Lisa and Brad living with us, it felt like we were all cramped together, trying to navigate adult lives while still being treated like kids. My parents doted on Brad, treating him almost like the son they never had. They would brag about him to anyone who would listen, and it was clear that he could do no wrong in their eyes. I, on the other hand, did not pay much attention to my sister's husband. He had developed an ego after listening to how proud my parents were of him. He would often ask me why I wasn't staying in the college dorms, even though he very well knew that it was my parents' wish. Overall, I not only got judgment from my parents but also my sister and her husband about my life choices. Meanwhile, I was working hard to balance my studies, a part-time job, and a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend, Mark, who was attending school in another state. My parents didn't think much of him. Just like I was compared to Lisa my whole life, they now were doing the same to Mark, by comparing him to Brad. They never outright said it, but their disapproval was clear in the way they dismissed him whenever I brought him up. Despite the tension, I tried to keep the peace. I would help out around the house, cook dinner, and do my best to stay out of Lisa and Brad's way. Lisa and I were never particularly close, but we had a cordial relationship. She was busy with her own life, and I was focused on my studies, so our interactions were limited to polite conversations and the occasional family dinner. Brad, on the other hand, was always friendly, treating me more like a little sister than just his wife's sibling. We got along well, and I appreciated having someone who didn't seem to judge me the way my parents did. But everything changed one day, out of nowhere, when my parents called me into the living room with serious expressions. It was just before my finals, and I was stressed out and exhausted from studying. They said they had something important to discuss, and I immediately felt a pit in my stomach. They looked at me with disappointment and anger, saying they had found some messages on my phone, messages that apparently proved I was trying to sleep with Brad, my sister's husband. I was completely blindsided. They showed me these so-called texts, but they were so out of context and clearly made up. I tried to explain that I would never, ever think of Brad that way. He was like a brother to me, and besides, I had my own boyfriend, who I loved with all my heart. But they wouldn't listen. It was like all the trust we had built over the years was gone in an instant. They accused me of trying to ruin Lisa's marriage and demanded that I leave the house immediately. Throughout this interaction, I begged them to let me talk to Brad, but Brad apparently was too shaken up by everything to have a chat with me. With nowhere else to go, I called my grandparents, desperate and in tears. I told them everything that had happened, showing them the real messages that proved I had no interest in Brad and that I was being falsely accused. My grandparents, who had always been kind and understanding, believed me without hesitation. They took me in, gave me a place to stay, and supported me through the worst time of my life. But my father was furious. He didn't like that I was staying with them and not being taught a lesson. One day, when I wasn't home, he came to my grandparents' house and lashed out at them, accusing them of spoiling me and undermining his authority. My grandpa and grandma defended me, and the argument ended with my father storming out, vowing never to speak to them again. It broke my heart to see the family torn apart like this. I often felt guilty, thinking that if I hadn't come to my grandparents, none of this would have happened. But then, the unthinkable happened. My grandpa passed away suddenly. It was devastating. I had never felt so much pain in my life. But what hurt even more was that my parents didn't come to his funeral. I was barely holding it together, trying to manage everything with my boyfriend's help, and on top of that, I had to take care of my grandma, who was completely heartbroken. Her husband was gone and her own son had abandoned her in her time of need. A few days later, out of nowhere, my parents showed up at my grandparents' house. I was still grieving, and seeing them only brought up all the anger and pain I had been trying to push down. I asked them why they hadn't come to the funeral, and they casually said they were out of the city. But I knew the truth, they were on vacation. My cousin had seen their posts and told me everything. But I kept quiet, holding back the urge to confront them. At that time, my boyfriend, Mark, was also staying with us for a few days, helping me and my grandma cope with the loss. The moment he came out to see my parents, my dad coldly asked me why he was there, as if Mark's presence was a problem. That struck a nerve in me. I had been holding everything together, managing the funeral arrangements, supporting my grandma, and dealing with my own grief, all while my parents were off enjoying themselves, ignoring their responsibilities. I felt a surge of anger rise within me as I looked at my father, who seemed completely oblivious to the hurt he had caused. I asked him who he thought had managed all the funeral arrangements, who had made sure everything was done properly, and who had been there for my grandma when she needed her family the most. Ideally, it was supposed to be him, as the son, who should have taken charge of these things. But he had been nowhere near us, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our shattered family. Dad didn't like that at all. He glared at me, clearly offended that I would dare question him, and told me to watch my tone, as if I was still the obedient child he could control. But I wasn't that person anymore. Then, almost out of nowhere, his entire demeanor shifted. The anger in his eyes disappeared, replaced by an unsettling calm. He suddenly became the calmest person in the room, speaking softly and saying that he wasn't here to fight. He claimed he wanted to let everything go and start fresh. He even said he was here to forgive me for what had happened with Brad, as if that was something I needed forgiveness for. He then mentioned that he would allow me to stay here with Grandma, but in return, he wanted something that was his. I was taken aback. A moment ago, he was telling me to watch my tone, and now he was talking about forgiveness and forgetting the past? It didn't make any sense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, it hit me, he was here for his inheritance. After everything he had put Grandpa through, after the abandonment and the betrayal, he was now here for money. He wasn't interested in making amends or fixing our broken relationship. He wanted what he thought was his, what he believed he was entitled to, regardless of the damage he had caused. But he had no idea that Grandpa was well aware of his motives. Grandpa, bless his soul, had taken care of everything. A day after the funeral, as we started clearing out Grandpa's room, we came across a note tucked away in one of his drawers. It simply said, "Call Bob." Bob was a lawyer and an old friend of Grandpa's, someone who had visited several times in the past, though I never thought much of it at the time. When we contacted Bob, he delivered the news that Grandpa had left behind a will, carefully deciding who would inherit what. Now that I think about it in hindsight, Dad's timing was almost too perfect. It was as if he knew the will would be brought up soon and wanted to stake his claim before it did. But I have to admit, it gave me a deep sense of satisfaction when I told him that I knew exactly what he was looking for. He wasn't here to reconcile, to mend our broken family, or even to offer any real forgiveness. No, he was here for Grandpa's savings, for the money he believed was rightfully his. But that wasn't going to happen. Grandpa had made sure of that. With a mix of calmness and firmness, I told Dad that Grandpa had left all the funds in my name. Every last bit of savings he had accumulated was now mine to manage. As for the house, Grandpa had signed it over to Grandma, ensuring she would always have a roof over her head, safe from anyone who might try to take it from her. Initially, I had planned to break this news when the dust had settled, when perhaps we could sit down as a family and have a civil discussion about everything. Maybe in another world, we could have found some way to reconcile and talk about Grandpa's final wishes with respect and understanding. But that possibility vanished the moment Dad stepped into the house with his entitled attitude, thinking he could bully and manipulate his way into getting what he wanted. When I told him about the will, I saw the shock and disbelief flash across his face. For a moment, he was speechless, unable to comprehend that everything he had been counting on was no longer within his reach. But then, as quickly as the shock that appeared, it was replaced by anger. He was such a narcissist that he believed that he had always been there for his parents. He accused me of lying, of manipulating Grandpa into changing his will, as if I had somehow orchestrated all of this. The irony was almost laughable, him accusing me of being manipulative when he was the one who had abandoned his family in pursuit of his own greed, but I stood my ground. I explained that Grandpa had made these decisions on his own, long before he passed, and that Bob, the lawyer, could verify every word I was saying. There was no conspiracy, no secret plot to cut him out. Grandpa had simply known where my parents' priorities lay, and he acted accordingly to protect what was most important to him, his wife and granddaughter. Dad's anger only grew as the reality of the situation sank in. He tried to argue, to convince me that I should hand over the money to him, that it was rightfully his as Grandpa's son. But I wasn't swayed. Also spoke up, pleading with me to reconsider, to find some way to make things right. But it was too late. She didn't react well either. I remember her saying stuff like, wasn't it enough I tried to steal Lisa's happiness, and now I wanted them to suffer too. They had shown their true colors, and there was no turning back. Grandpa had made his decision, and I intended to honor it. As they left, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. I watched them go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because my relationship with my parents had reached a point where there was no hope of reconciliation, and relief because Grandpa had protected us, even in his absence. In the days that followed, I focused on helping Grandma adjust to life without Grandpa, making sure she was taken care of and that she knew she was not alone. Mark stayed with us, providing the support and comfort we both needed during such a difficult time. And though the pain of losing Grandpa was still fresh, there was a sense of peace in knowing that his final wishes were being respected. Then, just when I thought the dust had finally settled, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Bob, Grandpa's lawyer, and it was addressed to me. I opened it, expecting some final details about the will or maybe a note of condolence. But what I found inside was something entirely different. The letter explained that Grandpa had set up a trust fund in my name. This wasn't a surprise, I already knew about the savings he had left me. But what caught me off guard was the requirement that came with it. The trust was tied to a piece of property in Florida, one that Grandpa had quietly purchased years ago. According to the letter, the property was to remain under my ownership, but with one condition. If my parents attempted to contest the will or tried to make any legal claim on Grandpa's estate, the property would automatically transfer to them, along with the funds tied to it. The twist? The property was nothing more than a broken-down, old house, far from the luxurious inheritance my parents would have expected. And the funds? They were barely enough to cover the taxes and maintenance costs for such a property. I sat there, stunned, realizing that Grandpa had not only anticipated my parents' greed but had set a trap for them. If they tried to challenge the will, they wouldn't just lose, they would inherit a financial burden that would drain them dry. A few days later, I received a call from Bob. He informed me that my parents had, in fact, tried to contest the will. They had hired a lawyer and were planning to take the matter to court, convinced that they could somehow claim the inheritance they believed was rightfully theirs. Bob, in his calm and measured way, explained to me that as soon as they filed the paperwork, the trust would kick in, and the Florida property and all its associated costs would become theirs. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Not because I was worried I knew they wouldn't win, but because it was exactly what Grandpa had foreseen. He had known, even in his final days, that my parents would let their greed drive them to this point. And now, they were walking right into the trap he had laid for them. When the court case began, it was clear from the start that my parents didn't stand a chance. The will was airtight, and Bob had ensured that everything was in order. But my parents, blinded by their desire for money, pressed on, thinking they could somehow overturn Grandpa's final wishes. Then, on the day the judge dismissed their case, it happened. The trust kicked in, and the Florida property, along with its financial burden, was officially theirs. They were furious, of course, realizing too late that they had been outmaneuvered by the very man they had tried to betray. I watched from a distance as they scrambled to deal with the fallout, trying to sell the property, only to find that no one wanted to buy a crumbling old house with a mountain of debt attached to it. Their financial situation quickly deteriorated, and they found themselves trapped in a mess of their own making. In a way, it was the ultimate poetic justice. Grandpa had managed to protect me and Grandma from their greed, even from beyond the grave. And while I never took any pleasure in their suffering, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. Now, my dad is angry, but instead of backing down, he started asking for my forgiveness. He tried to paint themselves as the victims, claiming he was just misunderstood, and that they only wanted what was fair. My mom has also been constantly dropping texts and voice messages, trying to sweet-talk me about everything. She talks about how families fight but always find their way back to each other, how Grandpa would want us to be united, and how she just wants to put the past behind us. But their actions speak louder than their words, and it's clear they haven't truly changed. They're not interested in reconciliation, they're interested in finding a way back into the money they lost. What's worse is that they've roped Lisa and Brad into their scheme. Suddenly, my sister and her husband are reaching out to me, trying to play the role of peacemakers. They're saying all the right things, talking about family and how we need to stick together, but I can see through it. It's all part of the game. Lisa, who had barely spoken to me since the accusation, is now acting like she cares about mending our relationship. They're all hoping that if they can guilt me enough, I'll give in and offer them a piece of the trust fund. They're trying to wear me down, to make me feel like I'm the one holding the family back, that it's my fault we're all so divided. And for the first time, I'm genuinely confused. Part of me wants to hold my ground, to keep what Grandpa left me and not let them manipulate me again. But another part of me wonders if maybe I should try to forgive, to find some way to move forward, even though I know their intentions are far from pure. So, Reddit, Ida for wanting to hold on to what Grandpa left me, even if it means turning my back on my family? Or should I try to forgive them, knowing full well that their motives might not be as pure as they claim? Update 1. For a day or two after my parents' visit, everything was surprisingly calm. It felt like, even though there was no hope for reconciliation, at least the drama might finally be over. I allowed myself to relax a little, thinking that maybe they had finally accepted the situation and moved on. But deep down, I knew it was too good to be true. The calm before the storm. Sure enough, just as I started to believe things might stay quiet, I received an email from my dad. The tone of the message was chilling. He wasn't just angry, he was seething with resentment and entitlement. He wrote that he knew all of Grandpa's money was rightfully his, and that I was nothing more than a thief for keeping it from him. He went on about how I was supposed to be a decent human being and do the right thing by handing everything over to him. Then, as if to add insult to injury, he brought up the Brad situation again, saying that he would graciously forgive me for what I did if I gave him the money. But if I didn't, I would face severe consequences. It was shocking, not just because of his words, but because of how far he was willing to go. The email was a direct threat, and it left me feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about money anymore, this was about control, power, and his need to dominate everyone around him, even if it meant destroying his own daughter in the process. As if that wasn't enough, I started hearing from family friends and distant relatives that my parents had been spreading all sorts of rumors about me. They were calling me a husband stealer, implying that I had tried to wreck Lisa's marriage and that I was some kind of manipulative gold digger. It was also a little funny because what gold were they talking about? Brad was living with his in-laws because it was cheaper. And while I did not judge him earlier, I was surely doing that now. The lies were hurtful, but what really got to me was how low they were willing to stoop. They were trying to ruin my reputation, to paint me as the villain in this twisted story they had created. It was like they were setting me up to be the bad guy, hoping that if they said it enough times, people would start to believe it. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I contacted Bob, Grandpa's lawyer, to see if there was anything I could do. I sent him an email and explained everything that had been happening. When we spoke, Bob was calm and reassuring, but he didn't sugarcoat the situation. He told me that, sadly, my dad could try to take the matter to court. Legally, he had the right to contest the will, especially if he was claiming that Grandpa was coerced or not of sound mind when he made his decisions. It was a weak argument, but it was enough to drag us into a lengthy legal battle if Dad decided to push it. The good news, Bob said, was that Dad didn't have much ground to stand on. Grandpa's will was solid, and we had plenty of evidence to show that he was fully aware and in control when he made his decisions. But still, the threat of a court case loomed over me like a dark cloud. Even if Dad didn't have a strong case, the stress, the legal fees, and the potential for more lies and slander were enough to make me feel trapped. I am angry, hurt, and exhausted. It feels like no matter what I do, they will keep coming after me. My parents were supposed to be the ones who supported me, who had my back no matter what. Instead, they were the ones tearing me down, trying to take away the security and stability that Grandpa had worked so hard to give me. So, here I am, preparing for whatever comes next. I've started gathering all the documents and evidence I might need if this goes to court. I've also started keeping a record of every message, every email, every voicemail that my parents send me. Bob said it could all be important if we need to prove harassment or intent to defame me. Still, there is a tiny part of me that wonders sometimes if I should keep fighting this battle, or if there is a point where I should just walk away. Maybe if I let them have what they want, this would all be over. But then again, what kind of message would that send? That they can take whatever they want if they just push hard enough? This is the only reason I am still standing my ground. Hopefully, the future holds better prospects for us. I will update you guys when something happens. Till then, bye. Update 2. Hi guys. What has happened in the past few days, I definitely did not see it coming. Lisa showed up at our door one morning, completely out of the blue. I was bracing myself for a confrontation, ready for her to throw every accusation she could at me. But instead of anger, what I saw was a broken woman. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. Before I could even ask what was wrong, she collapsed into tears, her entire body shaking as she tried to speak. Through the sobs, she told me what had happened. Brad, her husband, had been on a supposed work trip. Lisa, in an attempt to surprise him, decided to visit him unannounced. But when she got to his hotel, she walked in on him with another woman. The shock, the betrayal, it was all too much for her to handle. She confronted him right there, screaming at him, demanding answers, asking how he could do this to her. In the heat of the moment, she threw every accusation she could think of at him, including the one that had torn our family apart. Did he ever really think I was flirting with him? And that's when Brad, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left, finally told the truth. It wasn't me. It was never me. The texts that Lisa had seen, the ones that had made her accuse me of trying to steal her husband, were actually from one of his many flings. He had saved the woman's number under my name to avoid suspicion. He thought it was clever, a foolproof way to cover his tracks. But it all backfired when Lisa saw the messages and jumped to the worst possible conclusion. As Lisa told me this, my mind was reeling. All the pain, all the suffering, all the damage that had been done because of one man's lies. The fact that my parents had believed him, had turned against me without even considering that I might be innocent, was like a knife twisting in my chest all over again. But what Lisa told me next was even more heartbreaking. After discovering Brad's betrayal, she had gone to our parents, expecting them to support her, to stand by her side as she dealt with the mess her marriage had become. But instead of comfort, they told her to make it work with Brad. They actually advised her to forgive him, to let it go and move on as if his infidelity was just a minor bump in the road. They were more concerned about maintaining appearances than about their daughter's happiness. They didn't want the embarrassment of a divorce in the family, so they were willing to sacrifice Lisa's well-being to keep up the facade of a perfect family. Hearing this, I was torn between rage and pity. I was furious that our parents could be so callous, so blind to what their children were going through. But I also felt an immense sorrow for Lisa. She had been through so much, and instead of the support she desperately needed, she was being pressured to stay in a toxic relationship for the sake of appearances. Lisa kept apologizing, saying she was sorry for everything, for not believing me, for letting herself be manipulated by Brad and our parents. She said she didn't know who else to turn to, and that she didn't know what to do anymore. She felt trapped, alone, and completely lost. I didn't know what to say to her. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell her that this was the consequence of her actions, that she had chosen to believe lies about her own sister. But another part of me just wanted to hold her and tell her that we would figure this out together. We talked for hours that day, and by the end of it, I knew things would never be the same between us. But I also knew that we both needed each other now more than ever. Grandma told Lisa that she could stay with us as long as she wanted to. As for our parents, I don't know what will happen next. Now that the truth about Brad has come out, I wonder if they'll change their tune cause all of their manipulations were based on this. Let's see what happens next. Things have started to settle down, even though the emotional wounds are still fresh. Lisa is still struggling, understandably so, after everything she's been through. But we've started looking into divorce proceedings for her, making sure she's fully separated from Brad. It's a slow process, but it's a necessary step for her to start healing. On a more positive note, my parents finally did what they should have done a long time ago. They threw Brad out of their house. He's no longer staying there, and honestly, that's a relief. It's frustrating that it took this long for them to see the truth, but at least it's finally happened. In a surprising turn, Dad actually reached out to Grandma and apologized for everything, his absence during Grandpa's funeral, the way he treated me, and the strain he put on all of us. He assured Grandma that he wanted to make up for it and try to repair the damage he had caused. Grandma, though, was firm with him. She reminded him that while his apology was nice, it didn't change the fact that he wasn't getting any money or the house. What shocked me the most was that Dad actually accepted this without any argument. It felt like a small victory, even though I'm still cautious about his motives. Just a day ago, Grandma brought up something important. She told me she wanted to make sure her will was in order. She hasn't shared this with the rest of the family yet, but she confided in me that she plans to leave the house to Lisa. I think this is a great decision. Lisa deserves to have something stable and meaningful after everything she's been through, and being a part of our grandparents' legacy might help her find some peace. Looking back, everything that's happened has made me rethink what family really means. It's not just about blood or tradition. It's about the people who stand by you when things get tough, who believe in you even when others don't. My relationship with my parents might never be the same, but I'm okay with that. I have my grandma, my sister, and the support of those who truly care about me. Update 3. So, Reddit, this might be the last update. Things are far from perfect, but we're all finding our way forward. Lisa is starting to rebuild her life, and I'm hoping that my parents might finally be changing, even if it's just a little bit. I guess time will tell if they really mean it, or if this is just another phase in a long line of disappointments. But for now, we're all doing our best, and that's all I can really ask for. I know I haven't said this enough, but I am very grateful for all of your advice and support. Without your comments, I would not have gotten this far. Thank you for giving me so much confidence. Goodbye.